The logistical effort that sustained the Allied fight during the Second World War rested heavily on the shoulders of an often overlooked group, the men of the United States Merchant Marine. This fleet, designated as the very lifeline of freedom, was an essential component of the American national defense structure. Its purpose, mandated by the U.S. Merchant Marine Act of 1936, was to ensure that the nation maintained a fleet capable of carrying the majority of its commerce, while also serving as a vital naval or military auxiliary force in times of war or national emergency. This vast network of commercial vessels was effectively nationalized by the U.S. government following America's entry into the war. It was staffed entirely by civilian volunteers, merchant mariners who consciously chose to sail into the world's most dangerous waters. Their role was not fighting on the front lines, but rather executing the crucial logistical tasks required to keep the Allied forces supplied. Without the persistent global delivery routes maintained by these ships, the entire military effort against the Axis powers would have collapsed. The U.S. Merchant Marine's cargo held the key to Allied survival and eventual victory. Their vessels sailed around the globe, delivering necessary supplies that ranged from basic provisions to sophisticated machinery. This indispensable materiel included troops, food, equipment, and medical supplies. More critically, they transported war materials such as aircraft, vehicles, tanks, gasoline, oil, guns, shells, bombs, and ammunition. The success of every major campaign depended directly on the timely arrival of these goods. The scale of this operation required foresight and planning. Recognizing the looming threat of global conflict in the late 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt took preemptive action, ordering U.S. shipyards to drastically increase their output of ships necessary for potential warfare. Furthermore, to ensure adequate staffing for these growing fleets, Roosevelt established the U.S. Maritime Service. This service was tasked with the rigorous responsibility of training both merchant mariners and the personnel of the U.S. Army Transport Service. The commitment of the U.S. to aid its allies was formalized on March 11, 1941, when President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Lease Act into law. This program became the mechanism through which the U.S. began sending essential resources, including food, oil, fuel, supplies, and war materiel, to Great Britain, the countries of the British Commonwealth, China, the Free French, other Allied nations, and crucially, the Soviet Union. The flow of these supplies, facilitated almost entirely by the Merchant Marine, was the lifeblood of resistance against the Axis. When the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Oahu, U.S. territory of Hawaii, occurred on December 7, 1941, the United States was immediately thrust into the conflict. President Roosevelt declared war on Japan the very next day, December 8, 1941. From that point forward, the need for the Merchant Marine's global logistical services intensified dramatically. The ships that carried these vital supplies were, by necessity, less heavily armored than their naval counterparts, possessing limited defensive capabilities. To afford the ships and their civilian crews some measure of protection, guns were installed aboard the merchant vessels. These defensive weapons were not manned by the merchant mariners, but rather by a specialized unit of U.S. Navy Armed Guard military personnel. While the immediate threat was the enemy, the mariners faced an array of dangers inherent in global maritime transport. The perils included not only attacks from enemy warships, submarines, and aircraft, but also the relentless, unpredictable fury of the natural world. They navigated rough seas, avoided icebergs and mines, and contended with severe weather conditions. In the Pacific theater, Japanese kamikaze attacks presented a horrifying specialized threat. This combination of enemy action and environmental hostility made every voyage a life-or-death gamble. The Merchant Marine operated within the framework of massive, ongoing military engagements, none longer or more perilous than the Battle of the Atlantic. This extended campaign spanned the entire duration of WWII, beginning on September 3, 1939, and concluding only with the war's end on May 8, 1945. The conflict in the Atlantic involved relentless fighting between the Allied forces, which included the U.S., Canada, Britain, Norway, and Brazil, against the naval and air forces of the Axis powers. Their primary antagonists were the German Navy, the German Air Force, and, after Italy joined the Axis on June 10, 1940, the submarines of the Italian Royal Navy. Their shared objective was to interrupt and ultimately stop the critical flow of Allied supplies across the ocean. The most dangerous phase of the Battle of the Atlantic was a harrowing period that stretched from 1940 until the close of 1943. During these years, both the merchant vessels and the other ships escorting the convoys suffered staggering losses. To counter the persistent submarine and air threat, the Allies relied on the convoy system, a strategy intended specifically to protect the merchant ships as they sailed through wartime waters. Before the U.S. formally entered the war, convoys destined for British ports would assemble at designated points such as Halifax and Sydney, Nova Scotia, Canada. From there, the Royal Canadian Navy would provide initial escort services. These escorts would accompany the merchant fleet to a pre-arranged location in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. At that crucial midpoint, the Royal Navy of Britain would meet the convoy and take over the escort duties, guiding the ships to their final destination. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the U.S. Navy assumed responsibility for providing convoy escorts. The structure of a convoy was carefully planned to maximize protection. Merchant ships, the vessels carrying the essential supplies, were strategically positioned in the center of the formation. Surrounding and guarding this core were warships, aircraft, and submarines, forming layers of defense against Axis attack. Given the vast global nature of the supply routes, over 300 different convoy routes were active around the world throughout WWII. Each convoy was assigned a unique 2- or 3-letter code that served two purposes: identifying its destination and indicating the convoy's speed. An important operational limitation was that a convoy could only move as fast as its slowest ship. This constraint meant that even modern fast vessels had to throttle back, making the entire formation a potentially slower, though more defensible target.
The complex network of global supply lines included several critical pathways designed to get U.S. materials to the Soviet Union. Following Germany's attack on Russia on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union aligned with the Allies. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, urgently needed military equipment and supplies to sustain the fight against Nazi Germany. Great Britain immediately began sending supplies and war materials to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The very first convoy from England arrived in Arkhangelsk on August 31, 1941, marking the start of a hazardous supply route that would continue until the war's conclusion. Of the various routes used to send materials from the U.S. to Russia, the Arctic Sea route was recognized as the shortest and fastest. However, speed came with extreme danger. Beyond the omnipresent threat of Axis submarines, warships, and aircraft, the Arctic environment itself presented formidable obstacles. Mariners faced punishingly rough seas, frigid temperatures, and the constant threat posed by icebergs and massive ice sheets. A specific insidious danger of this northern route was the buildup of ice on the ships. This phenomenon could cause a ship to become top-heavy, severely increasing its risk of capsizing or rolling over. The risks inherent in the Arctic route were compounded by geography. Germany's military occupation of Norway, which had begun on April 9, 1940, placed Axis air and naval bases in close proximity to the Allied convoys sailing through the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Sea, and the Barents Sea. This proximity allowed German forces to rapidly intercept or track the vulnerable supply ships. The logistical challenges and inherent dangers of the Arctic route culminated in one of the war's most devastating naval disasters, the fate of Arctic Convoy PQ-17. This operation holds historical significance as the first combined Anglo-American naval operation of WWII to be conducted under British command. Convoy PQ-17 assembled at Wallfjord, Iceland, where escort vessels and merchant ships gathered for the arduous journey. Under the command of British Commodore John Dowding, the convoy set sail on June 27, 1942. Its critical destination was Arkhangelsk, Russia. Among the ships providing protection for PQ-17 was the American destroyer, the United States ship USS Wichita. The crew of the Wichita included Hollywood actor and U.S. Navy Reserve officer Douglas Fairbanks, Jr. Almost immediately after departing Iceland, the convoy was detected. A German submarine, U-456, sighted PQ-17 on or shortly after June 27, 1942, and began tracking the slow-moving formation. The German forces wasted no time in initiating attacks. The first casualty among the merchant vessels occurred on the morning of July 4th. The Liberty ship, steamship SS Christopher Newport, was struck and sunk by a German torpedo bomber, a Heinkel He-115. On that same pivotal day, the convoy faced a heavy assault from German torpedo bombers. Although the U.S. destroyer USS Wainwright, part of the covering force, successfully repulsed one attack, another Liberty ship, the SS William Hooper, was also sunk. The defining moment that sealed the fate of the convoy came on July 4, 1942, far away in London, England. The first Sea Lord and Admiral of the fleet, Sir Alfred Dudley Pound, received alarming, though unconfirmed, information. Swedish intelligence reported that powerful German capital ships, including the formidable battleship Tirpitz, had left their base in Norway with the specific intention of intercepting Convoy PQ-17. Admiral Pound sought counsel from Lieutenant Commander Norman Denning, an intelligence analyst operating within the Operational Intelligence Center for the Royal Navy. Denning, however, could not corroborate the terrifying rumor. He reported that he had not detected any German ship movements that would support the claim of the Tirpitz sailing, nor had he intercepted any radio traffic or messages from the Norwegian resistance indicating an imminent threat. Despite the conflicting information and lack of independent verification regarding the Tirpitz's movements, Admiral Pound made a decision of immense consequence. He issued a fateful order commanding the convoy's protection ships to withdraw rapidly westward. It is speculated that this withdrawal was intended to position the escorts to repulse the alleged German ships. Furthermore, he issued a catastrophic command to the remaining merchant vessels in the convoy to solve. They were to scatter and attempt to reach Russian ports on their own.
The immediate result was the complete abandonment of Convoy PQ-17. Both the close escort ships and the distant Allied protection vessels were ordered to detach from the formation. The merchant ships, already minimally protected, were suddenly left isolated. They were forced to plan individual routes to Russia, relying on ship compasses that were often inaccurate in that high-latitude region of the world. The timing could not have been worse. As it was summer in the Arctic, the region experienced long periods of daylight, meaning there was literally no place to hide in the dark. Without the protection of night, the ships, vulnerable and lacking sufficient defensive capabilities, became easy targets. The German command, surprised by the sudden fragmentation of the convoy, immediately recognized the opportunity this presented and took full advantage. German bombers and submarines found immense success in destroying the scattered merchant vessels. Although the battleship Tirpitz did eventually leave Norway on July 5th with the intent to intercept PQ-17, it returned to port that very same day. The reason for its return was simple. The German bombers and submarines had already achieved devastating success against the unprotected convoy. The map of PQ-17 ship losses starkly illustrates the depth of the tragedy. Out of the 35 merchant ships that originally sailed from Iceland, a mere 11 vessels would eventually manage to reach a port in Russia. The human cost was grievous, with 153 merchant mariners tragically lost. The loss of material was equally staggering, profoundly impacting the Soviet war effort. Reports indicated that the supplies, equipment, and war material destroyed included 200 aircraft, 3,300 trucks, and 435 tanks. Furthermore, other essential war supplies that could have equipped an estimated 50,000 men were sent to the bottom of the Arctic Sea. The fallout from the PQ-17 disaster was not limited to the loss of ships and men. Joseph Stalin was reportedly furious and utterly unable to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe. He publicly questioned the Allies as to why the crucial convoy protection had been so suddenly removed. The incident became a lasting source of tension, driving a wedge of distrust between the Soviet Union and its Western allies. The Arctic supply route was temporarily suspended, while the Allies desperately studied convoy plans to prevent a repeat disaster. It was not until September 2, 1942, that the next major shipment, Convoy PQ-18, departed Lough Eo, Scotland, sailing with significantly increased escort ships to provide the necessary protection.
The experiences of individual mariners offer a crucial human perspective on the vast logistical efforts and immense dangers of the war. Frank Edward Scott was one such merchant mariner, whose service spanned multiple theaters and contracts during the war. His life story and wartime experiences were recorded during an oral history interview conducted for the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, on October 25, 2010, in San Antonio, Texas. Frank Scott was born on May 9, 1925, in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He grew up alongside his two brothers, Dale and Quincy. In 1936, his family relocated to San Antonio, Texas. On the day the war dramatically changed American life, December 7, 1941, Frank was playing touch football when he received news of the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. After completing his education and graduating from Brackenridge High School in San Antonio in 1943, Frank immediately sought to contribute to the war effort. He went directly to the Merchant Marine recruiting office in the city and volunteered for service. His preparation began with basic merchant seaman training. In August 1943, Frank traveled to a maritime service base located in St. Petersburg, Florida. While at the base, the training staff discovered that he had experience teaching swimming back in San Antonio. Recognizing his skill, they asked him to remain at the base to instruct new recruits in survival swimming. Due to the lack of swimming pool at the training school at the time, Frank conducted his survival training sessions in the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico. He taught vital survival skills, including the essential technique of how to fashion a makeshift life jacket using a pair of trousers. He also instructed recruits on how to jump off a tower into the water, a practice designed to simulate the traumatic experience of abandoning a sinking ship. Frank's first actual sea assignment came aboard the oil tanker SS Washita, beginning on January 3, 1944. The tanker joined a large convoy consisting of approximately 200 ships destined for Swansea in Wales, England. Fortuitously, this convoy was not subjected to attack. By this stage of the war, the primary Atlantic route, while still dangerous, was less intensely threatened by German submarines than it had been in earlier years. Following the completion of the voyage, the Washita returned to the U.S. and Frank was discharged on February 2, 1944, having fulfilled the terms of his contract. The nature of service in the Merchant Marine differed fundamentally from military duty. Since it was a non-military organization, a merchant seaman signed a contract to serve on a specific ship, usually covering one or more trips to designated destinations. Once the contract was completed, the mariner had the choice to sign another. However, there was a significant caveat. If a mariner did not sign a subsequent contract within 30 days of discharge, he became eligible for the military draft. During this specific period of the war, supplies and troops were being amassed in England in preparation for the highly classified Normandy invasion, which was planned for June 1944. After taking leave to visit his family in San Antonio, Frank signed his second contract on April 20, 1944. This time, he sailed aboard a cargo vessel, the Liberty ship SS Samuel McIntyre. His commitment to this ship would last for nearly 9 months. The captain, whom Frank estimated to be around 65 years old, was a Scot who had been called back from retirement to serve in the emergency. Aboard the SS Samuel McIntyre and other merchant vessels, Frank's responsibilities encompassed the full range of a seaman's duties. These included general deck work, necessary maintenance like painting, standing watch, and steering the ship.
Life at sea revolved around the rigid watch schedule. Typically, 1/3 of the crew would be on watch at any given time. A standard watch schedule involved 4 hours on duty, followed by 8 hours off. The specific shifts were structured around the clock, such as midnight to 4 a.m., 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., 8 a.m. to 12 noon, and so forth. A particular challenge faced when traveling in the northern Atlantic, especially during the summer, was the prolonged periods of daylight. This lack of darkness made it notoriously difficult for the off-duty crew members to obtain sufficient sleep between their shifts. The workload did not ease upon reaching port. Tankers, due to the nature of their liquid cargo, usually required about 3 days to unload. Cargo ships, laden with a variety of goods, often took much longer, sometimes needing between 2 to 4 weeks to be completely emptied. When the pressure was on during unloading operations in port, crews could be required to work for 24 hours straight. Weather was a constant factor that demanded respect, with storms frequently wreaking havoc on individual ships and entire convoys. The size of the crew on a merchant vessel generally averaged between 40 to 50 merchant mariners, supplemented by approximately 35 personnel from the Navy Armed Guard. The ship's limited defenses were standard across the fleet. Typical gun placements included 5-inch guns mounted on the bow, long-range 8-inch guns positioned on the stern, and a considerable arsenal of about a dozen anti-aircraft guns.
To offer additional protection against German aerial attacks, some ships occasionally deployed barrage balloons. Adding to the psychological strain, crews did not always know their ship's final destination upon leaving the U.S. If the route was determined to be the Arctic or the Northern Atlantic, cold weather gear and specialized clothing would be distributed to the crew only after the ship had been at sea for about 24 hours. In the event that ships within a convoy were sunk, the responsibility of rescuing survivors fell to the destroyers or dedicated rescue ships, provided such recovery efforts were possible given the circumstances. Frank Scott recounted some specific, telling experiences during his time on the SS Samuel McIntyre. He would occasionally be called upon to take the helm and steer the ship when another particular seaman became visibly shaky or nervous due to rough seas. This crewman, Frank knew, carried the burden of having survived the sinking of 5 different ships. This anecdote highlights the profound psychological toll that the constant threat of attack exacted on the mariners. During a voyage bound for Cardiff, England, the Samuel McIntyre carried critically important cargo destined for the impending Allied invasion. Secured on the deck was a P-51 Mustang fighter plane, which was closely guarded. Also aboard were tanks, and, in preparation for the invasion of Normandy, hundreds of full 5-gallon gas cans, meticulously cabled to the deck to prevent them from shifting or being lost. Following the successful Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, the role of the Samuel McIntyre shifted. The vessel began performing necessary shuttle runs, transporting essential supplies and equipment between Cardiff and Omaha Beach. Subsequently, from July 15 to August 31, 1944, the Samuel McIntyre was anchored off Omaha Beach. It sat fully loaded, awaiting the Allied capture of the crucial port city of Cherbourg, France. As Allied forces pressed eastward toward Germany, the need for deep water ports and secure supply lines became paramount. The focus quickly centered on the large port of Antwerp, Belgium, and securing access via the Scheldt River. The British successfully captured Antwerp on September 4, 1944. However, German forces tenaciously held control of the west and east Scheldt estuary, effectively blocking access to the port. This led to the intense Battle of the Scheldt, fought between Canadian, Polish, and British units from October through November 1944. The Allied forces finally achieved victory on November 8, opening the way to the critical harbor. After the estuary was meticulously swept from mines, the first convoy carrying Allied supplies was finally able to unload in Antwerp on November 29, 1944. The SS Samuel McIntyre was among the very first ships to arrive at the newly opened port of Antwerp. Frank Scott recalled that unloading the cargo took approximately 4 weeks. Despite the port being in Allied hands, danger still lurked. While standing watch, Frank would sometimes observe flares from German artillery being fired into Antwerp, indicating that German forces remained uncomfortably close to the area. The continuing threat from the retreating German military was demonstrated tragically on December 16, 1944, the very first day of the Battle of the Bulge. A German V-2 rocket fired from the German SS Werfer battery in Hellendoorn, the Netherlands, struck the city. The rocket landed directly on the roof of the Cine Rex movie theater at 3:20 p.m. Inside the theater, where the American movie The Plainsman was playing, over 1,000 people were present. The devastating explosion killed 567 people, including 296 Allied servicemen. This single rocket blast resulted in the highest death toll from a single rocket strike during the entirety of World War II. The SS Samuel McIntyre departed Antwerp and sailed back to the United States in late December 1944. Frank Scott discharged from this contract on January 11, 1945. The Scott family celebrated the upcoming 1944 Christmas holiday with a special card honoring the military service of Frank and his 2 brothers, Dale and Quincy, as well as Quincy's wife, Dottie. Fortunately, all 4 would return home safely after the conclusion of World War II. Frank Scott soon signed his 3rd contract, boarding the SS Emile Ney Vidal on March 6, 1945, in New Orleans, Louisiana. This vessel was notable as one of the specialized concrete ships built during World War II. Frank would complete 2 consecutive sailings on the Vidal. His voyages took him through the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, calling at ports including Cuba and Puerto Rico. Among the crucial supplies transported by this concrete ship were sugar. The existence of concrete ships like the Emile Vidal speaks to the severe resource scarcity faced by the U.S. during the war. When steel resources needed for conventional shipbuilding became scarce, the U.S. government contracted McCloskey & Company of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to construct 24 self-propelled concrete ships. These vessels were built at the Hookers Point shipyard in Tampa, Florida, starting in July 1943, with the goal of producing one ship a month. They were named in honor of pioneers in the science and development of concrete. In addition to these self-propelled ships, the government also contracted for the building of concrete barges in California, though these lacked engines and had to be towed to their destinations.
A fellow crew member on this March 19, 1945 voyage of the Emile Vidal was Frank's good friend, merchant mariner Alfred Al G. Booth, who also hailed from San Antonio, Texas. Al Booth had a twin brother, Walter, who was serving in the U.S. Navy during the conflict. Frank and Al often met and exchanged stories when they were both back in San Antonio between contracts. Frank was discharged from his first sailing on the concrete ship on April 9, 1945. However, the very next day, April 10, 1945, Frank and Al signed on for a second voyage aboard the SS Emile Vidal. This contract lasted until they were discharged on May 21, 1945. Frank's final recorded contract during the war began on July 21, 1945, when he joined the crew of the Liberty ship SS Beckley Seam. This voyage marked a reunion of friends, as Al Booth and another San Antonio native, merchant mariner William McCullough, were also members of the crew. The SS Beckley Seam carried coal as its cargo, which it delivered to Savona, Italy. The ship was still sailing in the Mediterranean Sea when the announcement was made that World War II had finally ended. During his oral history interview, Frank Scott proudly presented a photograph he had personally taken of the American flag flying on the SS Beckley Seam. The caption he provided for the image read, "Stars and stripes on the U.S. merchant vessel Beckley Seam, somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea, August 1945, we three were there. Al Booth, Bill McCullough, and Frank Scott." The experiences of individuals like Frank Scott underscore the immense, often brutal logistical undertaking of the U.S. Merchant Marine, a force whose ultimate contributions and sacrifices are measured not just in tonnage delivered, but in lives lost and dangers endured. The sheer scale of the Merchant Marine's mobilization was significant. Throughout World War II, approximately 250,000 civilian merchant mariners served. Yet, due to the decentralized record-keeping system that existed during the war, precise figures on losses remained difficult to confirm. Estimates regarding the total number of merchant seamen and officers who were either killed or went missing vary significantly, ranging from 5,662 to over 9,000 individuals. Beyond those lost, an estimated 12,000 men were wounded and more than 600 became prisoners of war. The Warshipping Administration reported the final count of merchant ships sunk in World War II stood at 1,554 vessels. The collective disaster of Convoy PQ-17 remains a stark representation of the risks involved in these missions. The loss of 24 merchant ships out of 35, along with 153 mariners, demonstrated the vulnerability of the supply line when protective measures failed. The destruction of 200 aircraft and 435 tanks, which could have supplied a considerable force, had immediate strategic implications, highlighted by Stalin's profound anger and his questioning of why the critical protection had been withdrawn. This event, born of intelligence confusion and a controversial command decision, resulted in the temporary suspension of the vital Arctic route until plans could be thoroughly revised and additional escorts provided for subsequent convoys, such as PQ-18. The mariners operating these ships faced a constant battle against both human and environmental forces. The testimony of Frank Scott brings to life the technical and physical hardships. The necessity of standing watch for 4 hours on, followed by 8 hours off, was stressful, and the prolonged daylight in the northern Atlantic during summer further compounded the exhaustion by preventing restful sleep. Furthermore, the environmental dangers unique to certain routes, such as the Arctic ice buildup that could make vessels dangerously prone to rolling over, required specialized operational awareness. The psychological toll on the crews was evident, as illustrated by the man on the Samuel McIntyre who had survived 5 sinkings and became too nervous to steer in rough seas. Yet, the mariners continued their service, navigating storms that could wreak havoc on a convoy, delivering essential materials whether the destination was the highly threatened North Atlantic or the war-ravaged port of Antwerp. Their success in rapidly unloading ships, sometimes working for 24 hours straight in a dangerous port like Antwerp when German artillery flares were visible, demonstrates extraordinary dedication under pressure. Despite the high cost in lives and ships and the crucial nature of their service, the merchant mariners faced a prolonged struggle for recognition after the war concluded.
Because they were officially civilian volunteers who signed specific contracts, they were deliberately excluded from receiving critical benefits. The merchant seamen and officers were not included in the Post-War Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, famously known as the GI Bill. Nor were they qualified to receive other military benefits. This exclusion, based purely on their civilian status, was a profound injustice that lasted for decades. It was not until 1988, long after the war ended, that World War II merchant seamen finally received official recognition as veterans.
The Merchant Marines' experience was one of necessary, persistent risk. The close-quarters danger they faced is further contextualized by the military service of those around them. Frank Scott's brother, Quincy, for instance, was involved in a legendary incident while assigned to the USS Bory in the Atlantic. On November 1, 1943, the Bory rammed the German submarine U-405, which had surfaced. The two vessels became locked together, with the Bory's bow resting upon the submarine's foredeck. For a time, while locked in position, the Bory and U-405 exchanged small arms fire at point-blank range. Although both the destroyer and the submarine were ultimately lost in the incident, the survivors of the Bory were rescued by the escort carrier USS Card. While Quincy Scott's story involved direct combat, it highlights the extreme lethality of the Atlantic campaign that the merchant marine ships continuously sailed through. The enduring memory of the merchant marine's wartime role is occasionally reflected in culture. Frank Scott himself commented during his interview that the 1943 movie Action in the Atlantic seemed to be close to his actual wartime experiences. Furthermore, several WWII merchant mariners eventually transitioned into acting careers after the conflict, including recognizable figures such as James Garner, Peter Falk, Carroll O'Connor, and Jack Lord. The logistical backbone of the Second World War was maintained by the unwavering service of the U.S. Merchant Marine, a fleet manned by civilian volunteers who operated under contract but faced combat conditions. Their success in delivering over 7,000 words of war material, food, and fuel across hostile oceans was not incidental. It was the fundamental enabler of Allied military operations. The crucial insights derived from examining their service reveal several profound implications. Firstly, the reliance on convoys, though intended for protection, introduced operational rigidity, meaning entire fleets were reduced to the speed of the slowest ship. This system, though necessary, could be disastrous when compromised, as demonstrated by the Convoy PQ-17 tragedy. The fatal decision to order the scattered abandonment of PQ-17 demonstrated how critical unverified intelligence could lead to catastrophic military failures, resulting in the loss of vast resources and men and creating significant diplomatic rifts. Secondly, the practical realities of life at sea illuminate the extraordinary physical and psychological resilience required of these mariners. They performed routine duties like painting and steering, enduring extreme conditions, including weeks-long unloading shifts and the difficulty of sleeping in constant daylight, all while knowing that a survivor of 5 sinkings might be standing nervously beside them. The fact that they often did not know their ship's destination upon departure, only receiving necessary gear like cold weather clothing 24 hours into the voyage, underscores the unpredictable and responsive nature of their mission. Thirdly, the personal narratives, such as Frank Scott's trajectory from high school volunteer to seasoned mariner across multiple contracts, highlight the unique structure of their service. The contract system allowed them the choice of signing on again or facing the military draft, emphasizing the voluntary nature of their repeated exposure to danger. Scott's service on diverse vessels, from the oil tanker SS Washita to the specialized concrete ship SS Emile N. Vidal, and his vital cargo runs to locations like Omaha Beach and Antwerp, encapsulates the flexibility and breadth of the Merchant Marine's mission. Finally, the most significant implication regarding the Merchant Marine is the subsequent historical failure to adequately recognize their efforts. Despite suffering a casualty rate estimated to be extremely high, potentially resulting in over 9,000 missing or killed mariners, their status as civilian volunteers initially disqualified them from the vital support provided by the GI Bill and other veterans' benefits.
The decades-long struggle for official veteran status, achieved only in 1988, serves as a poignant reminder of how critical civilian contributions can be historically marginalized despite their indispensable role in securing victory. The sacrifice of 1,554 merchant ships and the lives lost ensured the delivery of the goods that equipped the fighting armies. Yet this crucial element of logistical heroism was historically understated. The successful prosecution of World War II was utterly dependent upon the uninterrupted flow of supplies, a mission that fell squarely on the shoulders of the U.S. Merchant Marine. They were the commercial, non-military fleet, nationalized for the duration of the conflict and crewed by thousands of civilian volunteers who accepted contracts to sail the world's most dangerous routes. From the implementation of the Lease Act in 1941 to the final days of the war in 1945, these mariners transported everything necessary for survival and combat, from tanks and aircraft to medicine and food.
Their service involved grappling with overwhelming threats, including submarines, aircraft, and weather so severe it could sink a ship by coating it in ice. The Convoy PQ-17 disaster remains a painful testament to the extreme vulnerability of these supply lines, demonstrating the immediate and strategic costs when protection was compromised. The loss of nearly two-thirds of the merchant vessels in PQ-17 underscored that despite limited defensive capabilities manned by the U.S. Navy Armed Guard, the mariners were often left at the mercy of overwhelming enemy forces when naval escorts were removed. Men like Frank E. Scott embodied the dedication of this critical service, repeatedly signing contracts to traverse the globe, whether delivering oil across the Atlantic, carrying munitions to the European invasion beaches, or transporting essential coal to Italy. Their logistical achievements, stockpiling war material in England, running shuttle operations to Omaha Beach, and successfully navigating mine-swept ports like Antwerp, were essential precursors to every major Allied land victory. Ultimately, the Merchant Marine's legacy is defined by their profound, often unsung contribution and the protracted fight for recognition. Their essential, critical role in the logistical theater of war ensured that the fighting forces were equipped to defeat the Axis powers. The recognition of their veteran status in 1988 finally acknowledged the tremendous sacrifices made by the 250,000 civilian mariners, many of whom gave their lives, who served as the indispensable lifeline that carried freedom across the oceans. Their story is one of sustained, essential heroism under extreme duress, fundamentally integral to the Allied victory in World War II.